Hi, it's Grandmama Doris. After a time, the disciples ceased to have their experiences of Jesus as a figure seen and heard, as an invisible presence which seemed to always be moving with help and encouragement at their side. He was no less a power than he had been before, but there were no more appearances such as those recounted in the concluding chapters of the Gospel. Jesus was with God, and God was his Father, and their Father, and he would never fail them. This was what they felt sure of after men told them that Jesus was gone, and this was what mattered. Of course, the question would be asked, how had he gone? And the early church answered it with a tradition which is framed in the idea which all men then had of this sort of world they lived in. There above the earth was the sky, and in the sky was heaven. It was to heaven, therefore, that Jesus had gone. So the tradition grew and was handed down that a company of disciples outside of Jerusalem saw him ascending from the earth toward the sky until a cloud received him out of their sight. Meanwhile, a new chapter of life and work was opening for the disciples. They had a commission from Jesus that they should be his witnesses. They must begin in Jerusalem itself. The first thing they did was fill up the number again of 12. Judas, who betrayed his master, was dead, but 12 to them was a sacred number. It was the number which Jesus had originally chosen, and it was the number of the 12 tribes of Israel. So all the little company of those who loved and followed Jesus met together in Jerusalem, and they chose another to take the place of Judas, and his name was Matthias. With his election, there begins a formation of the early church in Jerusalem. The history of the beginnings of the church is written in the opening chapters of Acts. To understand these rightly, it must be remembered that they were compiled later on in the first century from materials which had been handed down from the first generation to the next. By that time, there was a tendency to glorify the early church and to represent it as pure and disciplined, utterly devoted in spirit, and marked by many miracles of special heavenly favor. But as we learn from the letters of Paul, which make up a large part of the New Testament, the members of the early church were very human men and women, with their faults and their difficulties, which the Spirit of Jesus only began to change little by little. When we come to the story of the life of Paul, we shall be reading history which is in a large measure contemporary with its facts. But when we read the story of the first days in Jerusalem, we must remember that we are reading what men in the next generation like to think that the early church was the beginning. They had good reason to reverence it because it had dared to receive and preach the gospel of Jesus when this was very dangerous. And so it is not strange that tradition represented the first church as one in which great virtues flourished and in which sin met immediate and dramatic judgment. Here and there it indicates they are wrapped in magnifying mist of time, but nevertheless the outlines which matter most are clear, namely that here was a group of men and women made courageous by their faith in the living Christ, who created a fellowship which was extended across the world. After the election of Matthias, there came the feast of the Pentecost, one of the great festivals of the Jewish year. The disciples were still members of the Jewish church, for they still believed that the whole Jewish people might yet accept Jesus as the Messiah. They observed the holy days as they had always done, and worshipped according to the ancient ways. At the time of Pentecost, many pilgrims were in Jerusalem. The disciples were meeting together somewhere, perhaps in the upper room where Jesus had held the supper of the Passover. As they met and as they prayed, they were filled with a new spirit. They seemed to come to a sound from heaven as a rushing mighty wind and cloven tongues of fire. Then into a throng of people who had come together in the streets, Peter began to preach. All sorts of men were there, not only the people of Jerusalem and of Judea, but those who had come from many different provinces, Egypt, Arabia, and Rome. The rush and power of Peter's utterance held them all spellbound. Every man seemed to hear in his own tongue the message which Peter was conveying. He preached to them of the prophecies of the Old Testament and of the promise of the day when God would pour out his Spirit upon all flesh. And your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. He told them of Jesus, how he had lived, how he had been crucified, and how he had risen, and how his crucified master had been made by God for the Savior of all. Thank you so much.